You are listening to Christian America Ministries Worldwide, a weekly shortwave radio program and online podcast dedicated to uncensored, politically incorrect biblical teaching. To learn more about Christian America Ministries, visit our website, christianamericaministries.org. And now the broadcast.
Greetings in the blessed holy name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Thank you for listening to Christian America Ministries Worldwide. I'm your host, Matthew Dyer. We're broadcasting around the world on shortwave radio this evening, as well as over the internet at our YouTube channel, Christian America Ministries on YouTube, and KingdomRadioOnline.com. If you're listening to us on YouTube, please be sure to like and subscribe. I've been told that helps, so I really appreciate those that do that. And if you want to, leave a comment down below. Preferably a nice comment, but I'll take what I can get. If it's a bad comment, we'll deal with that too. But I appreciate everybody that does that. If you're listening to us on shortwave radio, I would love to get a reception report from you. You can go to our website, christianamericaministries.org, and go to our contact page and send us a reception report through there. Let us know how and where you're listening. It's always good to know who's listening to us on shortwave radio. And we really appreciate people that do that. It helps out a lot, knowing where to put our resources at. In this broadcast, this is going to be part 3 of a case for biblical kinism. We've been going over, for those that didn't get part 1 and 2, we've been going over the biblical reasoning for kinism, which is basically that the Bible teaches that there are different races, different peoples, different kindreds, and that they're to remain separate. And we've been going over some of the arguments, and actually we haven't even got to the arguments yet. We've been going over some of the biblical principles and laws concerning biblical kinism. And now we're going to start getting into more of the arguments of the matter, where people are coming back and saying, well, what about this verse, or what about that verse? And in this broadcast, we're going to be discussing, are we of one blood? And dealing with Acts 17:26. Which is usually one of the, not the first response, or at least one of them, probably one of the first responses that a biblical kinist will get when they present their argument that, God did create the races, and that they are different, and that they're to remain separate like He created them. That's the way He intended it. And people will come back and quote this verse here, Acts 17:26. And hath made of one blood all nations of men, for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed, and the bounds of their habitation. End quote. Whoa, that will drop that verse there like it's, it's an end to the argument. That's it. He hath made of one blood all nations of men. And therefore, what they will do with that verse is they will say, well, we are all one race because we are all of one blood, as it says there, and therefore there is no differences in races because we're all of one blood. There's many issues with that, though. We are not of all one blood. Even scientifically, we are not of all one blood. If you put the wrong blood type in a person needing a blood transfusion, they will die. Okay, there you go. We are not all of one blood just in that alone. There's different blood types. There's different genetics in the blood. We know that is not the case. We are not of all one blood in that. So people will say, if you respond that way, they'll say, well, all of one blood as in we're all of one race. Well, the passage doesn't say that. It says, and hath made of one blood all nations of men. Well, how do we get around that? I mean, to me, we know for a fact that there are different types of blood among different people. Like I said, with the blood types, you can't put the wrong blood type in a person. They will die. Their body will actually reject the blood, and they will die of it. They will reject it like a virus because it's not meant to be there. Because there's more than one type of blood. You may even remember back in the 90s, I think it was 1999, Ken Ham and a few other men co-authored a book called One Blood, The Biblical Answer to Racism, which the book was themed after Acts 17:26. And even though they really didn't address Acts 17:26 in the book, they just used it as a theme. On page 53 of their book, it says this concerning this passage. The Bible does not even use the word race in reference to people, but does describe all human beings as being, quote, one blood, Acts 17:26, and this, of course, emphasizes that we are all related, end quote. They use that, that's what they say concerning the passage in the book, and then they use that as a theme for the whole book. And it is true that the English word race does not appear in the King James Bible and other translations of the time, like the Geneva. It is true that they make that point to prove that there is no such thing as race, and therefore we are all one blood. That's how they go about it. But it does appear in other translations of the Bible after that period. Now, the reason it didn't appear in the King James is because the word race, as we use it today, wasn't very popular at that moment in time. It was a new word. It didn't really become in use until the 16 and 1700s. It wasn't being used in the way we use it in 1611 or 1599 when the Geneva was put together. But for example here, in the Brenton Septuagint translation, which was published in 1851, in this passage here in the book of Exodus, Exodus chapter 1, verse 9, it uses the word race, speaking of the race of Israel. It says here, and he said to his nation, behold, the race of the children of Israel is a great multitude and is stronger than we. End quote. And we know that's Pharaoh speaking of the children of Israel. Now, if we are all one blood, and they will interpret that to mean we are all one race, how can Pharaoh distinguish the children of Israel as a race when he says, behold, the race of the children of Israel is a great multitude and is stronger than we? We could replace race with kindred or people, but there's a difference there. In the Greek Septuagint, the word race in this passage here and others is rendered from the Greek word genos. That's where we get our word gene, genetics. It has a root there. The Oxford Dictionary of the Classical World defines genus as, quote, the word genus was widely and varietily used in Greek of all periods to denote species, genus, sort, category, birth, kin, race, lineage, family, generation, posterity, end quote. Now that definition of that Greek word, what does that sound like when you're talking about species, genus, sort, kind, birth, kin, race, lineage, family, generation, posterity? I mean, it sounds like they're describing what we would call modern day race. The difference between an Irishman and an African pygmy, or an Australian aborigine, or a Chinese man. James Strong, in his exhaustive concordance of the Bible, he defines genos as this. It's G1096, by the way. Kin, abstract or consecrate, literal or figurative, individual or collective, born, country, diversity, generation, kind, kindred, nation, offspring, stock, end quote. So, once again, James Strong, in his definition of that word, it seems to line up with the Oxford Dictionary there, that the word genos is describing what you and I would describe as a modern-day race. And this Greek word genos also appears in the New Testament in the epistle of 1 Peter concerning the Israelites of the dispersion, and is translated as generation in the King James. Let's read that there. 1 Peter 2:9. But ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that ye should show forth the praise of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Now, for those that say that race does not appear in the Bible, the word race does not appear in the Bible, it's interesting. Most of those people are not King James only people. Those people that normally say that are usually using New American Standard, ESV, or something like that. And if someone was to tell you that there is no such word as race in the Bible, I would ask them what Bible translation that they're using, because it does appear in the Bible, in the New Testament, in some translations. For example, the New American Standard in 1 Peter 2:9 translates race the same way that Sir Lancelot Brenton did in his Septuagint in 1851. Says this: "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." That there is speaking of race, a race of people. And depending on what Bible translation you'll have, it'll say the same thing. For example, let's look here. The ESV says chosen race. The Berean Literal Bible, chosen race. The Legacy Standard Bible does it as a chosen family, which is not bad. I mean, I don't disagree with that at all. The Amplified Bible, a chosen race. The Christian Standard Bible, a chosen race. The Hallman Christian Standard Bible, a chosen race. The American Standard Version says an elect race, which there's nothing wrong with that. Let's see here. The ERV, English Revised Version, an elect race. The Good News Translation, chosen race. The Net Bible, a chosen race. Let's see here. The Weymouth New Testament, a chosen race. The World English Bible, a chosen race. And we can continue on. There's a bunch of them here. Not all of them, but there's a bunch. Young's Literal Translation, a chosen race, or a choice race, excuse me. So, depending on what translation you have, it does have the word race in it. And that's important to note, because for those that say, well, the word race is not in the Bible, well, it just depends on what translation you have. But with all that being said, all these translations I just mentioned translate this Greek word genos as race in this passage. So it does appear, and in my opinion, and I think you probably will agree at this point, for someone to say that race does not appear in the Bible, the English word race does not appear in the Bible, as an argument for saying that the Bible does not teach there is such a thing as different races, is a straw man argument and very dishonest. Because it just depends on what translation you have. But the thing to note here is that the word genos, and other words like it, mean the same thing as our English word race today. Let me give you this example here. Before William Tyndale translated his Tyndale Bible in 1535, the English word Passover did not exist, because it was invented by William Tyndale. For those that don't know, William Tyndale invented that word. Before 1535, the English word Passover did not exist, along with a bunch of other words, by the way. Atonement, for example, that he invented that one as well. If you want an interesting study, search on the internet words that William Tyndale invented when he translated his Bible. Now, he invented a lot of them, like atonement and Passover, but no theologian would ever argue that there is no such thing as Passover before 1535 or atonement. Why? Because they would understand that Tyndale took the Hebrew word for Passover, Pascha, and carried the meaning into the newly developed word Passover the best he could as a translator. Same thing he did with atonement. He carried the Hebrew or Greek, Hebrew in this case, but every translator will do this no matter what language it is. They carry the meaning from one language to another to the word. The same goes for this word genos, because the concept of race, kindred, and people is embedded in the Greek and Hebrew words of the Bible if you examine the context. And they are translated into different words in our English Bibles. Race being one of them, a more modern word, but in older translations, kindred is used and things of that nature. Now, the way we use the word blood in the 21st century is very important because it is not the same way that ancient Israel would have used the word blood. And that's the key point here in Acts 17:26. We use it to denote race, heritage, family, lineage. We may say that person over there has royal blood in them. And what we mean by that is they are related to English royalty. In their family, they have royal blood, a royal family in their family tree. Usually pretty close if we say that sometimes. Or what if we say that person over there is a Choctaw Indian? Or, excuse me, we say that person over there has Choctaw Indian blood in them. Now, do we literally mean that they have Choctaw Indian blood in them? No, we use it to denote heritage, just like we'd say that person had Cherokee blood or African blood. We are using that word blood to denote heritage. Now, we may even say that person over there is a mixed blood. What do we mean by that? Well, we mean that they have a mixed heritage. Usually they're parents of a different race. Two different parents of different races, and they are the product of that relationship, so they are mixed blood. The issue with our common usage of this word is the Bible never uses the word blood in the same way we use it today. Did you know that? Rather, the Bible uses blood to mean life, not heritage, not family, but life, and a life source of all living men and animals and everything, not one's heritage. So that's very, very important to note. And I'm going to give you a few examples of how the word blood is used in the Bible. It says here in Genesis chapter 9, verse 4, "But flesh with the life thereof, which is the blood thereof, shall ye not eat." Now note there, this is the commandment for them not to eat blood. But it says here, "But flesh with the life thereof, which is the blood thereof, shall ye eat." So the flesh and the blood there are connected to life in that passage. Let's look at another one. Leviticus chapter 17, verse 11. It says here, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that maketh an atonement for the soul." Now, see there? We have, for the life of the flesh is in the blood. That's a biblical principle. It's a scientific principle that we know. It's a biblical law, scientific law, that we know that the life of a man is in his blood. If you take the blood away, he's dead. The Bible knew that long ago. Deuteronomy 12:23 says this, "Only be that thou eat not the blood, for the life is the blood, and thou mayest not eat the life with the flesh." So the Israelites, as many of you know, were forbidden to eat blood. It wasn't healthy for them. They weren't supposed to do it. God didn't want them to do it. And even today, it is not recommended to eat blood. It it can have pathogens and diseases in it that we weren't meant to eat. And the Bible says the reason why is because it's describing it as the life is in the blood, so don't eat it. Jonah, chapter 1, verse 14. Let's look at this passage here. It says here, "Wherefore they cried unto the Lord and said, We beseech thee, O Lord, we beseech thee, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not upon us innocent blood, for thou, O Lord, hast done it as it pleased thee." This is an interesting passage because the other ones we mentioned before was speaking of life in the blood, as in what you don't eat, and atonement, sacrifices, and things of that nature. In this passage, this is the men on the ship, and they are contemplating throwing Jonah overboard. And then they said, "Let us not perish for this man's life." So basically, they're saying, "Let us not be punished for killing this man, and lay not upon us innocent blood." Now, notice that blood here, innocent blood, is how they're putting it, is connected with the man's life. So we even use this same terminology today. When we say innocent blood, we're speaking of an innocent person, an innocent life, someone that's innocent that maybe was murdered. We would say that that person over there shed innocent blood. We may even say it to talk about someone that's guilty. When we say what? A person has what on their hands? Blood on their hands. And what is that being referred to in that when we use that? Well, we're speaking of life. We're not speaking of someone's heritage. We're speaking of someone's life. So even today, we use that terminology the way it does in the Bible. But not always. We'll change it up, and then we'll use it for heritage. And as you can see from these 4 verses that we looked at, just as one example, you can do a more in-depth study. It appears often in Scripture. Blood isn't used to mean speaking of a person's heritage or kindred or race. Rather, it's speaking of the life force that makes them alive. And we know today that blood carries oxygen, vitamins, antibodies, electrolytes, and other vital sources to our body throughout, from head to toe, to keep us alive. One of the issues in the 1800s and 16 and 1700s, I guess, they would practice something called trepanning, because they believed that a man could be unbalanced, and so therefore they would let blood out of one side of his body to help balance the body, because they thought that sickness was caused by imbalancing of the blood on one side of the body versus the other. And we know today that it's not a very wise thing to take blood out of a sick man. That's how you make him dead. You're taking the life force out of him. So what Acts 17:26 is saying is all men have the same life force, not that all men have the same race or heritage, but rather they all have the same life force. They all have the same type of blood that makes them alive. The same can be said for a dog too, or a cat. The same principle goes for them. If you let the blood out of a dog, the dog will die. It's not that complicated. Now, there is a phrase in the Bible that does denote heritage the same way that we use the word blood today. And that phrase is bone and flesh, which is used quite a bit in Scripture. And it's used in a way that is speaking of heritage, race, kindred, family. We can look at Genesis chapter 2, verse 23, which says concerning Adam and Eve, "And Adam said, This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man." End quote. Now, in this passage, we have Adam referring to Eve as being the same type of person, not the same sex, obviously, but the same type of person, because she was taken out of his body, and it came out of him. God took a rib and made her from him, and now he's saying, "This is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh." And so he's saying that there is a common kindred between him and this woman. Genesis chapter 29, 13 through 14 says this, "And it came to pass, when Laban heard the tidings of Jacob, his sister's son, that he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. And he told Laban all these things, and Laban said to him, Surely thou art my bone and my flesh. And he abode with him the space of a month." End quote. Now this passage here, speaking of Laban, speaking to Jacob, his sister's son, so it's his nephew, and he is saying, "Hey, you surely look like one of us. thou art my bone and my flesh. What he's saying is surely you're one of my kindred. You're one of my people. Now let's turn to Judges chapter 9, verse 2. It says here, Speak, I pray you, in the ears of all the men of Shechem, whether it is better for you, either that all the sons of Jerubbaal, which are 70 persons, reign over you, or that one reign over you. Remember also that I am your bone and your flesh. End quote. And what he's saying here is he's saying, remember. We come from the same type of people. We have the same heritage. Remember that I am of your bone and I am of your flesh. Now let's look at 2 Samuel 5:1, which says, Then came all the tribes of Israel to David unto Hebron, and spake, saying, Behold, we are thy bone and thy flesh. Quote. Another one, 2 Samuel 19:12. Ye are my brethren, ye are my bones and my flesh. Wherefore then are ye the last to bring back the king. End quote. Now, in these passages here, it's speaking directly of the first one there in 2 Samuel 5:1, is speaking of David unto the children of Israel, saying that, hey, we are bone and flesh. Then came all the tribes of Israel to David, and they are all one bone and one flesh. Well, we know that there's a heritage there. David was an Israelite. And the same thing here in 2 Samuel 19:12, it says, Ye my brethren, ye are my brethren. Ye are my bones and my flesh. Well, there's two words there to denote heritage there. The word brethren, and then we have the phrase there, bone and flesh. So, the 21st century way of how we speak of a relative or someone of our own race using blood is not biblically accurate. Someone back in the days of Paul or David, they would have walked up to you like Laban did and say, Surely thou art my bone and my flesh. Not surely thou art of the same blood as I. Now, during the Old and New Testament, they just didn't use blood that way. That wasn't how they used it. In fact, I did a word study on how. I was trying to figure out when we started using the word blood to denote heritage. I couldn't find a whole lot on it, other than it did start in the Middle Ages. I couldn't really find exactly where it began, but it started becoming more popular in the Middle Ages, around 1500, maybe 1400, somewhere in there, A.D., so long after the writing of Acts 17:26. And Paul just wasn't speaking about that. He wasn't speaking of race in that passage. He was speaking of life force. And also note this too. It says in that passage in Acts 17:26, And hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed, and the bounds of their habitation. So here we're speaking of bounds and boundaries and divisions of these people that he's speaking about. Another thing, I don't like to focus in on this much, but another thing to know is most manuscripts, there's very few manuscripts that actually have that word there, one blood. It's usually one of all nations of men. Let's see here. In E.W. Bullinger, he states this concerning this passage, says, quote, The text omits blood. The one here means either Adam or the dust of which he was formed, end quote. Now, if you were to take what he said there, the passage is speaking of Adam. So, and not just Adam, but Adamites in that case. So people who came from Adam. And also, this is important to remember too. Most translations today, and I'm talking about modern translations, like the ESV, the ASB, the NIV, the NASB, LSB, and several others, they don't even have the word blood there. It's not even there. So the people that are making that argument, I would ask them what Bible translation they're using, because I've had people tell me that the Bible says we are all in one blood, and then they're not even reading from the King James. And I have no problem with how the King James renders that passage. It's easy to understand that he's speaking of life, not heritage in there, and that the people that use that one single verse to create an entire doctrine that contradicts other passages of the Bible, they need to read the entire context and try to understand not just the context of Acts, but like we looked here, the context of the whole Bible. Ask yourself, where else in Scripture does it use the word blood to denote heritage, race, kindred, stock? And it doesn't. Blood is used for life. Simple as that. Now, if Paul had written, and hath made of one, it hath made of bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, all nations of men, they would have an argument. They would have an argument, because then you could go all throughout Scripture and say, hey, this phrase here is to denote heritage, not life, heritage. And but that's not what's said. That is not what is said at all. It's very clear. If you look at the entire context of the Bible, that is what he's speaking about. Now that we've covered the one blood passage, we're going to be talking about who is your neighbor. In the subject of biblical kinism, one of the objections of biblical kinism is the biblical neighbor. What is your neighbor? And then they'll throw the passages throughout the Bible concerning your neighbor. And I don't know about the rest of the world. Maybe some of those out there that listen in different countries can chime in the comments below if you're listening to us on YouTube, how your culture defines a neighbor. But in America, when we think of a neighbor, we think of our next door neighbor. Unless you live in a rural area like I do, I don't have a next door neighbor. My neighbor would be the closest person that lives to my house. And I mean, they could be a half a mile away or 5 miles away, depending on where you live. And that could be your neighbor. I've lived in some places where, you couldn't even see your neighbor. And when discussing kinism, or even our ever-growing mass immigration problem here in America, I've heard many Christians say in objection to pro-kinist theology, something like, everyone is your neighbor. And make an argument that we as Christians should love every kindred exactly the same, to the degree that we should want them to immigrate to our country and be a part of our people, no matter the cost, because to do otherwise is disobeying Jesus. And if you were to challenge that person who believes that everybody in the world is their neighbor, and ask them, hey, can you give me a biblical text that backs that up? Because I really don't think economically and socially that mass immigration into any given country by another people is a good idea. I mean, I can show you and explain to you why. And historically, we can see how it's detrimental to a society and a kindred and a people, and that's how nations are destroyed. And they say, well, I would look at Matthew chapter 22, verse 34 through 39, because Jesus makes it very clear we are to love thy neighbor as thyself. And hey, that little Guatemalan kid that wants to come here and his family, all 5 million of them, they want to come in to America and live down the road from me, they should. They should, because they are my neighbor, and I should love them as I do my own children, and I want them to stay here. At least that's the argument they would give. Let's look at Matthew chapter 22, verse 34 through 39. It says here, but when the Pharisees had heard that he had put the Sadducees to silence, they were gathered together. Then one of them, which was a lawyer, asked him a question, tempting him, and saying, Master, which is the great commandment in the law? And Jesus said unto them, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it, Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. End quote. In this passage, the sect of the Pharisees are trying to entrap Jesus by having him tell them what he thought the greatest commandment is. They're trying to entrap him. And Jesus replied by summing up all the laws of God in a very short sentence. And how did he do that, you may wonder? Well, it's simple. If you love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, you will obey him and follow his commandments. John 14:15 would be one that you could look up. and to not want to worship false gods. You want to serve God. How do you serve God? You follow His commandments. You do what He tells you to do. That's how you serve and worship Him. If you truly love your neighbor, you won't steal from him, which is part of the law. You won't cheat him. You won't murder him. You won't support the things that hinder him. You'll do things in the Bible, laid out in God's law, that are described as loving your neighbor, which is, obeying God's law. You won't steal from him. You won't murder him. That's loving your neighbor. You won't cheat him. You won't put him into usury. You won't charge him usury on loans. You'll take care of him. You won't do things to hinder him, like mass migration or mass immigration. That hinders our neighbor. It hinders his children. It causes foreigners to come in and steal their jobs. That affects your neighbor. Every law of God found in the Bible fits into one of these two categories, either loving God with all your soul, mind, and spirit, or loving thy neighbor as thyself. This wasn't a new idea, what Jesus was presenting. It wasn't. It was rather a very old idea found in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4 through 5. He was quoting from the Old Testament. It says here, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might." End quote. There's the first great commandment. Now, let's see where we can find the second great commandment, which was in the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 16 through 18. It says here, "Thou shalt not go up and down as a talebearer among thy people, neither shalt thou stand against the blood of thy neighbor. I am the Lord. Thou shalt not hate thy brother in thy heart. Thou shalt in any wise rebuke thy neighbor, and not suffer sin upon him. Thou shalt not avenge, nor bear any grudge against thy children of thy people, but thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. I am the Lord." End quote. Now, notice here in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 16 through 18, it says here, "Thou shalt not go up and down as a talebearer among thy people." Oh, there we go. We're talking about thy people there. Okay, now let's continue on. "Neither shalt thou stand against the blood of thy neighbor," or we could say the life of thy neighbor. There's another instance where blood is speaking of life. It's not speaking of heritage, because we're already speaking of someone's neighbor, which is of thy people. And it goes on to say, "And I am the Lord. Thou shalt not hate thy brother in thy heart, and thou shalt in any wise rebuke thy neighbor, and not suffer upon him." You see, the words here, neighbor and thy brother and thy people, are all interchangeable. Thy people is the same as thy brother, and thy brother is same as thy neighbor. And it says here that thou shalt not avenge nor bear any grudge against the children of thy people, but thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. The concept of a neighbor from the verse that Jesus is quoting is directly connected with thy people and thy brother, thy brethren. Because the Israelites were a kinnish nation. They didn't have other people immigrating there and living among them the way that so many communists are promoting today. So the concept of thy neighbor would have been a kinnish concept to the Israelite. When you said thy neighbor, they would not have thought you were speaking of the Hittites or the Amorites or the Canaanites. That's not what would have came to their mind. Their mind would have automatically been drawn to a racial brother of theirs, the Israelites. And when they love thy neighbor as their self, he's not advocating, when Jesus says that, he's not advocating that all people are the same. I'm breaking down the God-ordained racial boundaries which God put in place, and now I'm saying you should love everybody as thyself. He's not advocating that. He's not advocating that we are all to intermingle and become one race, a melting pot of bronze men. No, he's not advocating that at all. He's instructing us that we should love our people as we would ourselves because they are part of us. I remember in one of the previous parts we spoke about usury. and how in God's law, the Israelites were commanded not to charge usury to their kindred, but they could charge usury to a nokri, which was a person outside of the race of Israel. Now, that's because the Israelite people were a part of them. They weren't supposed to hinder them in that way, but they could other people. Now, this isn't to say that Jesus is teaching that one kindred is to hate another kindred just because they are not of your people. He's not saying that at all. A lot of people will take that this way, that he's saying, love thy neighbor as thyself, so therefore you need to hate everybody else. No, what he's saying here is that you are to love your kindred in a way that takes priority over someone else's kindred. So what this means is that your race and your nation should take priority over another race and nation. You should be more concerned about your own race and your own nation rather than some foreign nation on the other side of the world. American foreign policy could use a lesson in this, because we are very good, the United States government is very good at sending money and funds and resources to everyone under the sun rather than their own people, which is a whole other subject, but this concept's the same. A Kinis nation, a biblical Kinis nation, wouldn't do that. They'd put their people above all other people. Is it because they hate everybody else? No, it's because there's priorities that must take place. I love my wife. I love my wife because she's my wife, but that doesn't mean I hate all other women. There's another concept we could use. I love my son. That does not mean, and I love him above all four of my sons, above all other sons. Does that mean I hate all other sons? No, it does not. There's priority, a kindred priority there. Oftentimes, biblical kinists are accused of hating other races, and that's not the case. I don't hate other races. I don't hate them for who they are, not a little bit. God made them that way, and I want them to stay that way. I don't want them to intermingle and cease to exist, their culture be erased. I want them to stay the way God made them. I want them to have their own culture. I want them to have their own heritage. Just like I want my family, my kindred, my race, my sons to do the same. This is natural and biblical. We don't see bluebirds taking in cardinals and their young into their nation and treating them as their own because they believe that they're all one bird. No, it doesn't work that way. Now, that may be a silly analogy, but it stands true. You don't see deer taking in coyotes and raising them as their own, or vice versa, and sending foreign aid and taking the food out of their own kindred's mouth to give it to others. No, there's a priority set in place. Let's look at 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8. In the New Testament, we have this same kinist principle and law given by Paul. It says here, "But if any provide not for his own, especially for those of his own house, he hath denied the faith and is worse than an infidel." End quote. Now, think about this verse for a minute. If any provide not for his own, okay, that's what he's speaking about. And then he zooms it in. And especially for those of his own house, so that's his own family. He hath denied the faith and is worse than an infidel or unbeliever. We're instructed by Jesus to love our specific kindred as ourself, our neighbor. And here Paul, he's focusing this commandment in even more by saying that we have to provide for those of our own family, our own household, or we are like an unbeliever that has denied the faith. We're like an atheist. Now, many may be wondering why, what does this have to do with biblical kinism? And the answer is it has everything to do with biblical kinism. Paul is stating that your own kindred, your household, especially your household, but your own, is more important and takes priority over some other household in, let's say, a different country, belonging to a different kindred. So biblically, my household takes more priority than a household in Ireland or a household in Guatemala, or a household in Australia, or New Zealand, fill in the blank. My household takes priority, a biblical kinist priority over them. And there's nothing wrong with that. It would be wrong for me to abandon my children, abandon them, send them out in the streets, or take food out of their mouth and give it to some other child in another country, in another kindred, another nation, and give it to them, and let my children starve. My family, my household should take priority. That is natural. People will do that whether they consider themselves a biblical kinist or not. A father and mother, unless they're insane, is not going to take food out of their baby's mouth to give it to somebody else's baby and allow their baby to starve. Our instinct, everything in our body tells us not to do that. And the same goes for our tribe, our kindred. And you can broaden that outside of your household to your extended family. Perhaps your congregation, your church congregation. Those people are your own. They would have a higher priority than some other congregation on the other side of the world, just naturally. I mean, you would put your priority and your focus on your local congregation, not strangers on the other side of the world. Same thing with family, immediate family, your race. Those things take priority. And there's nothing wrong with that. Jesus wasn't saying that, love thy neighbor as thyself, as in let everybody in. No, he was quoting a passage speaking of brethren, loving their brethren as their self, their neighbor. And you have to look at the context of that passage to understand what he was speaking about. So a Christian who would support, let's say, an open border policy into their country, which would allow millions of racial foreigners to flood in, that bring with them a false religion. Their presence lowers the job rates for their own kindred and the wages for their own kindred. We've seen that with Mexico the last 30 years, how you'll have Mexicans come in and work for less, and our own kindred pays the consequences for it. Crime levels, they'll raise when these foreign invaders come in. Crime levels raise. Just look at the cities that have a lot of the immigrants that have been coming into this nation just here recently. Not to mention, the past 30, 40 years. The crime levels jump, they skyrocket. It destroys communities. A Christian that would promote that is denying the faith, and they're not a Christian. They are worse than someone who is an atheist, because all those things affect their household and their own people in a negative way. Now that's strong language. I know some people have a hard time with that, but that is truth. We are not to support those kind of things because it hurts our people. Now, some people may look over at Luke chapter 10, and they may be wondering about the Good Samaritan. They may say, well, bad foreigners, yes, but what about the good ones that do something good? Because Jesus gave a parable there concerning the Good Samaritan, and it appears that Jesus is saying in that passage that anyone that does a good deed is your neighbor. To you is your neighbor. Let's go ahead and read that passage. Luke chapter 10, verse 25 through 37 here. And it says here, "And behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tempted him, saying, Master, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And he said unto him, What is written in the law? How readest thou? And he answering said, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy strength, and with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. And he said unto him, Thou hast answered rightly. This do, and thou shalt live. But he, willing to justify himself, said unto Jesus, And who is my neighbor? And Jesus answered and said, A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and fell among thieves, and which stripped him of his remnant, and wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. And by chance there came down a certain priest that way, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side, and likewise a Levite. And when he was at the place, came and looked on him, and passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was. And when he saw him, he had compassion on him, and went to him, and bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and wine, and set him on his own beast, and brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And on the morrow, when he departed, he took out two pence, and gave them to the host, and said unto him, Take care of him, and whatever so thou spendest more, when I come, I will repay thee. Which now of these three thinkest thou was a neighbor unto him that fell among the thieves? And he said, He that showeth mercy on him. And then said Jesus unto him, Go and do thou likewise. End quote. This passage, and the way that it is commonly interpreted to mean, is anyone who does a good deed to you is your neighbor, is based on the false idea that all those who lived in Samaria were non-Israelites. They take this passage to be a racial thing. And many people will teach that everyone in Samaria was either a non-Israelite or a mixed people. And it is true there were mixed people living in the land of Samaria. But they were not all that way. For example, in John chapter 4, when Jesus is speaking to the woman of Samaria, she acknowledges that Jacob is her father, John 4:12, and even understood some of the scriptures concerning the coming Messiah. The Samaritans and the Israelites were directly related. They had a very rough history with one another, some big animosity towards each other that went back generations. They did not like one another. And the reason Jesus picked the Samaritan to be the good guy in this case, or the good neighbor, I should say, because Jesus knew of the bad history among the two groups of people, the Judeans and the Samaritans, and he knew that lawyer would have never picked that Samaritan to be the good guy in a million years. He would have picked the Levite or the priest because of the history. And if you think about it, in this parable, Jesus is increasing the qualifications of a true neighbor as not just being of the same kindred. Remember, that's already a qualification from the passage that he quoted. Not just being someone of the same kindred, but also having a love for each other like was commanded by Jesus in Matthew 22:38. So, the Levite and the priest would have been the kindred to this man, and so would have the Samaritan. But because of the bad blood of the Samaritans, the bad history, he wouldn't have picked him. But he was good to him, so he increased the qualifications and was a true neighbor to that person. If we interpret this passage to mean anyone universally who does a good deed to you is your neighbor and should be welcomed into your home, your country, your congregation without any qualifiers, we're going to have some huge problems. Imagine if a man who, murdered 5 people and is heading home after dumping their bodies in the swamp and find you stranded on the side of the road and with a flat tire and decides to do a good deed and help you change your tire, maybe to get an alibi, who knows, but and get you back on the road. Although a good deed, it would be very unwise to invite him into your home or invite him to move in next door to you. Just because of that single deed, that one qualifier. Or perhaps you have an open homosexual in your community that is the kindest, most loving person you've ever known. I've heard that often. So thoughtful. He's the nicest person I've ever known. Now, although this person may be kind to you, they may be your own kindred. Because they are a homosexual and in sin, they are not your true neighbor. And it would be, as an example, be very unwise to ask them to babysit your 10-year-old son for the weekend. They may be your kindred, but they're not your neighbor because of that disqualifier. They are not among your people. Even though, like I said, they may be of your kindred, but Jesus increased the qualifications. So they need to be Christian. They need to be one of yours in that way. Same thing, if you're a Christian and your next door neighbor is a kindred to you, but they're a Satanist, they're not your neighbor. They don't hold the same values as you. But most people take this passage in Luke 10 to mean anyone that does a good deed is welcome. But that's not true. Based upon this false position, a murderer, a rapist, a prostitute, a thief, or any kind of fornicator, any person of any false religion, should all be accepted as your neighbor as long as they do a good deed every now and then. This is not what the Bible teaches. A biblical neighbor is someone who is of thy people, and out of your people, someone who loves you as your neighbor, as their neighbor, as they do themselves. Or in other words, they are Christian. So those are the two qualifiers. They are of your people, and they love you as their neighbor as they do themselves, and you likewise. Not just anybody. If you want to learn, and I forgot to mention this a minute ago, if you want to learn more about the Samaritans, I did do a 2-part series on the Samaritans back in, it was a sermon series, not a radio series, back last summer. So if you want to learn more about them, I'll add that in there because there's some rich history there that I would recommend everybody to be at least familiar with. With that being said, there's much more that can be said on neighbors, but I think we covered enough that a biblical neighbor has qualifiers. It's not just anybody. Thank you for listening to Christian America Ministries. We're about done on this hour here this evening, and next week we'll pick back up with part 4 of A Case for Biblical Kinism. We'll be discussing the objection to kinism that Moses married a black woman, which is a common one. If you're listening to us on shortwave radio this evening, I'd love to hear from you. If you can go to our website, christianamericaministries.org, and send us a reception report. Let us know how and where you're listening. If you do that, send me your address, and I will send you a free copy of one of my books, free of charge, just as a thank you for doing that. I really appreciate everybody that checks in and does send that. We got a reception report the other day from the UK, so the signal's getting way out there. I haven't got one from the UK in a long time, so I really appreciate that reception report. And those listening to us on YouTube this evening, please be sure to like and subscribe, and throw a comment below, and share these broadcasts and help them get out. We really appreciate that. And until next time, come back next week for another broadcast. You've been listening to Christian America Ministries Worldwide. Thanks for listening.
America, you once revered the name of God. From mountain crest to valley green with grassy sod. But see how you have wandered into foreign ways, where black and white of wrong and right have blurred to grays. Reclaim America for God, O Christian race. Throw down the Antichrist from every holy place. No king but Jesus Christ, the faithful minute man. And so do we who claim America again. The law of God was once the law of this his land, and no offense.
Thank you for listening to Christian America Ministries. If you are blessed by this outreach ministry, please consider going to www.christianamericaministries.org to our contact page and donating to our radio ministry to help keep this program on the air. We appreciate your support.
You have been listening to Christian America Ministries Worldwide. Come back next week on shortwave radio or on the internet for our next broadcast. To learn more about Christian America Ministries, visit our website, christianamericaministries.org. Thank you for listening.